$1 million. Free to play. You just need to survive. It's the Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Pick one team to win each week. Get it right, move on. Get it wrong, you're out. The last fan standing take home a guaranteed $1 million cash prize. And for every player who joins, we add $1 to the pot, up to $10 million. The Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Play free on the Fanatics app. App access open to all. Must be 21 plus and joined by 9/8 to play. No purchase necessary. U.S. only. Void where prohibited. Subject to complete terms. See fanatics.com/game rules.
Hey, it's me, shakeable, breakable, unmistakable Claptrap. But don't break me, break free in Borderlands 4, the newest, bestest looter shooter you can play with friends. Everything's better with friends, and I would totally know. Pre-order Borderlands 4 now.
Rated mature.
Talk about stepping up. Bang! Bang!
It's time to level up your game. Introducing the all-new ESPN app. All of ESPN, all in one place. Your home for the most live sports and the best championship moments.
The electricity is palpable.
Step up your game with no annual contract required. It's the ultimate fan experience. Level up for more on the ESPN app or at stream.espn.com. Sign up now.
The right to self-defense, is that something that we even have in Canada? It's become a big debate of late after a couple of high-profile cases and after some comments by a chief of police. Hello, I'm Brian Lilly, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast, and today we're going to delve into this issue. You may have heard of the story of a man in Lindsay who defended himself with a kitchen knife after an intruder broke in with a crossbow. And you've most definitely heard of the case of a man in Vaughan, Ontario, shot and killed by home invaders after putting a gun to his 4-year-old daughter's head. These are trying stories. They are difficult to listen to. They are difficult to deal with. But they have brought on a discussion about self-defense and whether that even exists in Canada. Some people would claim that's American. We don't have it. They would be wrong. But unfortunately, many people in high positions tend to help feed into that idea, including York Region Police Chief Jim McSween, who had these comments to say last week.
As it stands, we know the best defense for most people is to comply. As you've just heard, a number of safety recommendations will allow for those that are victimizing members in the community to leave and not harm anyone.
So what is the reality? What is the truth? What does the law actually say? For this, I turn to an old friend, Solomon Friedman. He is a partner at Friedman Mansour Law. He is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, criminal defense lawyer, and an expert in self-defense. Here is our conversation. So, Solomon, when you heard Chief Jim McSween make those comments about be a good witness, about go hide in a bathroom somewhere, what did you think? I mean, my view is, yeah, for some people that is the right answer, but that is not the only answer, and it's not the answer for everyone. And to me, it just felt like it was the head of police saying, we're not really interested in people defending themselves. We're willing to let criminals do what they want to do.
Yeah, you know, what struck me first and foremost was that it was terrible legal advice, okay? Not so much that it was bad life advice. In other words, if someone is in that, and it's a horrifying scenario, we need to understand that, right? Because this has both, legal, but very much real life implications. It's a horrifying scenario. Your home gets invaded, usually in the middle of the night. You've got strangers who are armed and making demands if they're not there just to do harm. But the legal response is not necessarily the same as the practical response. And what really irked me, listening to that, I'm obviously listening to it through lawyers' ears, which is there was no discussion about what is legal and what is not legal. So instead, you have the chief of police of one of the largest police services in the country essentially giving life advice. But when it comes from the chief of police, people think that it's legal advice. And the number of calls or texts that I got, whether it's from professional colleagues or friends or family, saying, "Is that right? Is that the law? Is the law that I have to comply with a home intruder, an invader?" And I say, of course, that's not the law. So that's number one: is that it's bad legal advice. What he said is not the law.
So my take on it was that this was not just a response to the shooting death of Abdul Alim Faruqi in his home in Vaughan. This is the man who was shot during a home invasion while the thugs, apparently had a gun to his 4-year-old daughter's head. I mean, what father is not going to react viscerally in that? We don't know how he reacted, but we do know that in the end, the thugs killed him and left. But my thought was, he is also responding to the ongoing debate in Canada related to the incident in Lindsay, Ontario, where a guy breaks into someone else's home with a crossbow, and the man whose home it is defends himself with a kitchen knife and is therefore charged with aggravated assault with a weapon. He was trying to justify that, in my view, is, and you've dealt with this in a lot of cases. So listeners that don't know you might be saying, well, he's a criminal defense lawyer. He just defends these thugs. You've defended a lot of people on issues like this of defending themselves and then being charged. The idea that you cannot defend yourself is foreign, but cops and prosecutors do not like Canadians defending themselves.
Yeah, I'm thinking back now. I represented an individual going on about 10 or 12 years ago. It was a father and a son. Okay, their home was invaded. They come onto the scene of this individual who was totally hopped up on drugs. The father tries to confront him. He gets the father in a headlock and he is choking him out. And the son, who was a young man, got a knife, and obviously in an effort to do nothing more than save his father's life, stabbed this man to death. Okay? They were arrested by police. They were held. And ultimately, and maybe there was some reasonably good lawyering involved as well. It was a drawn out process, but the police made the decision not to lay charges. Okay? What they did was absolutely legal. And in fact, if we go back to the practical advice side, it was the right thing to do if this young man was going to save his father's life. So self-defense is absolutely legal in Canada. It is a full defense to a charge up to and including murder. In fact, it is so serious of a defense that once the individual establishes that that defense is even remotely possible, to use some legal terms here, air of reality, that it has an air of reality, the Crown has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that self-defense was not legally engaged here. The trouble is, though, with the police, that the police, and I'm seeing this more and more in my practice, they often take a charge first and ask questions later perspective, sort of saying, look, maybe it's self-defense, maybe it's not, let the court sort it out. And in some ways, by the way, for the people who are charged, even though many of them are acquitted, the process is the punishment in of itself, which then has the effect of deterring others from defending themselves.
For someone who is charged, how long does that process take, this punishment that you're talking about? It's years, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you, if it's a murder case that can only be tried in the Superior Court, the time limit that the Supreme Court set from charge to trial is 30 months. It's 2.5 years. That's the limit. So it takes years to move through the system. And by the way, during those years, let's remember, you have been publicly identified and branded as a criminal by the police and in the media. You are probably living, if you're lucky, by the way, if you're on bail, because you may be in custody. If you're not, you're probably living on very strict conditions, maybe house arrest, maybe you have a GPS monitor, all because you are sort of in the crosshairs of the state because you exercised self-defense. So absolutely the process is the punishment, both in terms of time, in terms of conditions, but also in terms of the stigma of being charged with a really serious criminal offense.
Yeah, I look, even a year of going through that is incredibly horrifying. 6 months of going through that is horrifying. Never mind 30 months. That is ridiculous. So why is it that police and you got to face off against Crowns. Maybe you don't want to talk about them, but to me, it's Crowns as well. It is this view that no. Despite what the law says, and we'll get into how clear the law is in a moment, despite what the law says, we don't like what the law says, and so we're going to put you through this process.
I think there's a cultural element to this as well, in the sense that we sometimes hear different terms, and it's really important to just attack them because they have no place in this discussion, including, by the way, our friendly police chief. He talked about people taking the law into their own hands. And you sometimes see that also, the phrase vigilante justice or vigilantism. Okay?
If you break into my home, it's not vigilantism for me to beat you out of there.
Correct. And it's not taking the law into your own hands. In fact, what would be taking the law into your own hands is after they get your stuff or they're running away, you get in the car and you fire up flashing lights and you go arrest them and you get a posse together. Like, that's a different story. Now, by the way, there are rights of citizens to make arrests, but much dicier in that territory. But defending yourself is not taking the law into your own hands. It is not vigilantism. So I think there's a cultural issue here. And, the trouble with 90% of us living along the American border is that culturally, whether it's politicians or police or prosecutors, we're always comparing ourselves to the American experience. And there's this sort of, innate dislike of what happens in the United States. And we don't want to be like the Americans. That's what they do in America. That's cowboy justice. When really, the criminal code has self-defense provisions, which, by the way, are not new. They are ancient. They go back to the earliest foundations of the English common law. They happen to be today codified in the criminal code. But this is old common law stuff. The right to defend yourself, other persons, and your property. That is a long-standing right that now is in the criminal code. So it's not taking the law into your own hands. But unfortunately, I think there's this sort of cultural bias where that first reaction is, well, why didn't you comply? And it's we see it in the statement of the chief.
Well, I want to read you a statement that Chief McSween put out in response to some of the media criticism that may have come from I don't know, myself, my colleague Joe Warmington, anyone with a brain, lots of people on talk radio, but not Andrew Coyne. It states, when I told citizens not to take matters into their own hands, it had nothing to do with politics or concern over force used against the perpetrators of home invasions. It was suggested as a tactic in the hopes of preserving lives should citizens be confronted with an armed intruder. When it comes to defending property, material items can be replaced, lives cannot. There is no one piece of advice to offer citizens who are faced with an intruder in their home, but calling 911 immediately and avoiding engagement with the suspects has proven to be an effective course of action. These situations are dynamic, chaotic, and difficult to assess in the moment. So that goes back to your earlier point that this was life advice. This was Chief McSween being Dear Abby.
Which is not the place of a chief of police, right? It's not what one expects. It's also, by the way, anytime a figure in authority says that the evidence says, right, the research shows, I say, I want to see that research, because there has actually been an enormous amount of research done in the United States in particular about the links between things like stand your ground and castle laws, which I'm happy to talk about in the United States, but also the prevalence of armed citizens and the deterrent factor that has on criminals from committing home invasions. So in fact, it actually cuts the other way. If you tell everybody to comply, what that is actually telling criminals is you are going to have a free hand.
It's funny, John Lott, the great researcher, the man behind the book that most Canadians would scoff at, More Guns, Less Crime. It's true. I believe you
it's
know.
On my bookshelf, by the way, in my office, Brian. I've got a signed copy.
I believe you know John, as do I. And John called me after he saw what Chief McSween said, and he said, we have to talk. And he said, unfortunately, you don't have the same data in Canada as we do in the States with their I forget the name of what it's called, but they look at outcomes of crimes. And he was able to tell me what specific actions in confronting intruders work and what don't. And he was able to say that, especially for women being attacked by men who are often larger than them, that hitting them with their fists is, that's a really bad course of action. But pulling out a gun, you don't even have to shoot. Just showing it is often enough to save their lives. But he said, just rolling over does not actually lead to safer outcomes. And he disputed what the chief was saying there.
Yeah, it's interesting because and I've read that data, and in fact, that conversation refreshed my memory, and it made me go back and look at some of those studies, and they're really eye opening, and it really comes down to, and we can talk about this later as we talk about criminal law policy generally, and what laws might be able to be put in place. Can laws actually be directed to this kind of behavior? But I'm a believer, and my experience in criminal law shows me that there's very little in terms of legal deterrent that is going to deter individuals from committing this kind of crime. Like, the person who's doing a home invasion is not like, well, there's now a mandatory minimum of life in prison. Before it was just 10 years. I'm not going to go kick down that door trying to feed my addiction by stealing or robbing, etc.
Doesn't mean we shouldn't do those mandatory minimums.
No.
But it's
you and
not
I
necessarily
disagree about that. And I'm happy. It's a good discussion to have. It's an important policy discussion to have. But what everybody who studies deterrence concludes is that one of the biggest actual deterring factors to criminals is fear of being apprehended or of being harmed in the commission of a crime. So you got to think about that for a minute, right? So things like police presence.
So it's not the sentence, it's being caught or shot.
Exactly right. Right? When you're in that frame of mind, right? Remember, your life's taken a certain path if you're kicking down doors in suburban GTA and performing home invasions. So, jail, the possibility of jail is rarely the immediate deterrent. The deterrent, however, is getting arrested at that time or being shot. And that's what the data shows from the United States, that actually has a deterrent effect on criminal behavior. So my worry is that when Chief McSween is talking, remember, he's speaking to two audiences, and he might not even realize it. Audience one are the innocent homeowners. And whether the advice he's giving them is good or bad, we can debate that. And I think it's generally might be poor advice. But he's also speaking to criminals. They're listening. And what message did you just send?
Exactly.
When you kick that door down, it's going to be easy peasy for you. Nobody's going to put up a fight. You are not going to be harmed in the commission of this crime. You have a free rein to engage in this kind of dangerous and antisocial behavior. Like, to me, that is really troubling.
All right, let's talk about what the law actually states, and then about what conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has suggested in terms of clarifying the law. I hear people say, well, we need castle law in Canada. And my response to them is, no, we don't. We have it. Am I wrong?
It depends how you define castle law. If you define castle law as no obligation to retreat when faced with the threat of violence, you're absolutely right. We have it. Okay. What castle law in some jurisdictions means, and I think it is, I think it would be helpful in Canada, would be that if you commit a violent offense against an uninvited visitor into your home, the presumption is that you are acting in self-defense, unless the Crown can then rebut that presumption. In other words, self-defense gets put on the table automatically. That's what happens in some other states. So just there is no one version of castle law, but I agree with you that if we're talking about no duty to retreat, you don't have any duty to retreat.
Okay, so let's talk about you said it was ancient, comes from the common law.
Yeah.
Explain what it actually means and is required right now, because too many Canadians, Andrew Coyne, believe that any self-defense is too American. You alluded to that earlier. This is not reality, and never has been.
No, not only is it not reality, but you almost certainly have a constitutional right to self-defense. That is, if the government tomorrow passed a law amending the criminal code and removing self-defense, that would be found to be contrary to Section 7 of the Charter, because it would put your life in jeopardy, and it would be contrary to the principles of fundamental justice. So to say that...
I thought that section only defended bike lanes in Toronto.
Well, bike lanes, I think that gets about 50% of the attention. But as an actual constitutional litigator, I can tell you that you have a constitutional right to self-defense. The government, that's my view, and I think it's well supported by the jurisprudence, the government could not essentially amend out self-defense. So let's start with that. So this notion that it's American, that it's foreign to us, is nonsense. It is part of that constitutional guarantee.
Centuries.
Absolutely.
It goes back centuries in common law.
Yeah. So
Section 7 and now codified.
Yeah. So since the earliest criminal code in Canada, there has been a self-defense provision. And let's talk about what today's criminal code allows for, right? So remembering that self-defense is a defense, okay? It is an answer to a criminal charge. And that can be a lot of criminal charges, anything from murder and on down. And what is the defense? How does it work? So it has 3 elements to it, right? The first element is that the person who acts in self-defense has to believe on reasonable grounds, which means that their belief is reasonable. They don't have to be right, by the way. They just have to be reasonable. That force is being used against them, another person, or that force is going to be used. So that's also really important, by the way. Self-defense doesn't mean you have to hit me first. If you have a reasonable belief that a threat of force is being used, you're in self-defense territory. So that's number 1.
So, for example, this incident in Lindsay, if I'm staring down a guy who is coming to my home with a crossbow, and I'm guessing that most listeners have never fired a crossbow, they are incredibly precise and deadly instruments in the right hands. I would be terrified. I would assume that they were going to shoot me with said crossbow. I would be within my rights to attack in defense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'll just say this about the Lindsay incident. And I'll say this about any incident where all the evidence has not been aired in court, tested by cross-examination, and ruled on by a judge or jury. We
don't know all the details.
We just don't know, right? Which is why I got asked to comment a lot on it, and I was really reluctant to comment on that case because I have no idea if the knife was used with a crossbow raised or the crossbow was wrestled away and the homeowner's like, you know what? You so-and-so, I'm going to get this knife and I'm going to show you what happens once I have you defenseless. Or somewhere in a spectrum in between those things. I just don't know. Okay. But when you talk about the law, so absolutely that would seemingly engage a belief on reasonable grounds that force is being used. So that's number 1. You have to have that belief. Number 2, the act that you are engaging in has to be for the purpose of defending yourself, right? So you don't now just get a free hand to break any law. The act has to be for the purpose of defending yourself. So to give you an example, let's say somebody has broken into your home, okay? And you have reasonable grounds that force is being used against you. That's true. But what you do is let's say you see their car in the driveway, you go slash the tires. So that criminal act, slashing someone's tires is a criminal act. It's not for the purpose of defending yourself, right? The act has to be for the purpose of defending yourself. And then the third thing, and this is the trickiest part, because number 1 and number 2 are almost givens in every self-defense case. The third element is the trickiest, which is your actions have to be reasonable in the circumstances. And until, by the way, the Harper amendments to the self-defense provision in 2012, that's where the section ended.
Let's take a break right now and come back and talk about the Harper amendments, because that is part of the pushback against what Pierre Poilievre is saying. And people saying, well, the law's already been clarified. I was there for it. I watched it from beginning to end, and I don't think a lot of people get it. So quick break, back in a moment with Solomon Friedman.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hey, listen to this. All I needed was a new starter. Got a great deal on eBay. Did it myself.
Yeah, that's cool. But how about the soft purr of an upgraded exhaust when it fits just right?
For me, it's the little things, like these new windshield wipers from eBay I installed.
From small fixes to big upgrades, eBay has all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. eBay, things people love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
You don't technically need this car. You say that out loud to yourself. You say, I have no space. You say, I'm just looking. Then you click. Then you zoom in on photo number 87 and whisper, Oh no. Then you text a friend, the one who always enables you. You say to yourself, this is the last one, knowing it is not. You don't need this car. But maybe, just maybe, this car needs you. Bring a trailer. It's never just a car.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Well, if you don't want to get shot or beaten up, don't break into people's houses. It's pretty straightforward.
I don't know. This sounds like pretty good advice from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith to me. You don't want to get shot, don't break into somebody's home. Although, there's a whole debate about whether you can actually use firearms. But Solomon, let's talk about the 2012, I believe it was, amendments to the criminal code. That all started with a bill that was actually originally suggested by now Toronto Mayor, then NDP MP Olivia Chow, and Liberal MP Joel Volpe, and it was called the Lucky Moose Bill. And this is named after a grocery store. I believe it's on Dundas Street, downtown Toronto. Guy was tired of habitual criminals sneaking in and stealing from him. And so one day he just stopped him and tied him up, and the cops charged him. And no, it's self-defense. That prompted a huge debate around self-defense. And at that point, the NDP, the Liberals, the Conservatives all said yes. Now, it didn't pass as a private member's bill. Election happened, so on. But the Harper government picked it up after the election, passed it, and they clarified it. What did they clarify back in 2012? Because in my mind, what was happening then is what's happening now, is police and prosecutors are saying, I know the law seems pretty clear to you, but we're going to take a different view of it, and we're going to do what we want to do. That was my feeling then. That's my feeling now. What did the Harper changes clarify?
Yeah, and I think in particular, we now have 13 years of hindsight, and my conclusion is that they didn't clarify anything at all, and it didn't actually change the way that self-defense operates in our courts. So having tried cases before the amendments and after, but let's talk about them a little bit. And it's really funny. I'm really glad you brought up the Lucky Moose context, because this is what happens, Brian, when you've been around for a while. You realize
you remember things.
You remember things, and you realize there is nothing new under the sun, and this is no exception to that. So that was David Chen. David Chen was the shopkeeper, the proprietor of Lucky Moose, and it galvanized.
You have a better memory than me.
I just, I think, Brian, to be perfectly honest, I think that I have appeared on a show of yours, 13, 14 years ago, and we've talked about this.
Yes.
I got a feeling that happened. So, and that led to this sort of uproar, and the same discussion we're having now, which is, are police charging people appropriately? Are prosecutors prosecuting? Are people being wrongly convicted? So this is what happened. All right. And we'll come back to exactly where we left off before the break, which is the third element of the self-defense analysis was the act that was committed reasonable in the circumstances? And prior to 2012, like so much of our law, by the way, the details and the explanation was left to the common law, which means it was developed through case law. Judges would apply that. They would say, well, this is reasonable, this isn't reasonable. Some of those judges would get overturned by the Court of Appeal. Maybe that would get overturned by the Supreme Court. And over generations, the law gets clarified that way. All right. And judges in their decisions would say, how do you know an act is reasonable? Well, you look at this factor. You look at this factor. How big were the people? What were their weapons used? What was the threat of violence? All this sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah. So, if a 7-year-old comes into my home with a knife and I shoot them, that's not reasonable.
Correct. And different if a man comes in, without a knife, if a guy's just banging on the front door, if they're inside the home, or for example, if it's somebody who you know to be extremely violent, right? You're right. There's all of
these things factor in.
So what this amendment did basically was they got some law student or parliamentary intern to go search the case law to find all of the factors that judges have previously considered in assessing the reasonableness of an act, and they just listed them in the criminal code. That's it. That is actually what was done. So for me as a lawyer, someone who understands how the common law works, it wasn't necessary in the first place. The trouble is police often didn't know about them. Maybe some crowns weren't familiar with all of them, but they existed in the law. Nothing new happened in that provision. All of the factors were ones that were already recognized in the case law. And instead now...
But it should have informed pre-charge. It should have informed the police and prosecutors, but I don't think it has.
Brian, I'm going to tell you what I told you 13 years ago when we talked about this. I said, the law is not the problem. Policy is the problem. Parliament does not have to pass any laws. What has to happen are the provinces, who are responsible for the charging decisions of police. They need to amend the policy handbooks of the police services and of their crown attorney's offices. Because every province, and in the jurisdictions where it's federal prosecutors, like the territories, they have desk books, policy manuals for prosecutors, and it has their policies on every type of offense, from domestic violence to sexual assault to major crime to homicide. The policy needs to change. And guess what? The policy never changed. So, of course, the charging practice and the prosecuting practice never changed.
That's something that Conservative MP Larry Brock brought up when Pierre Poilievre held his news conference to talk about this. Larry said the provinces and territories could deal with this right away. Just send out a note. Stop doing this.
That's exactly right. Right. Amend the policy. And like I said, they have policies on every type of offense. They have policies on defenses. They have policies on how they prosecute, what charges they lay. It's actually interesting. A possible remedy, Ontario has an interesting system. So unlike British Columbia and Quebec, for example, in Ontario, the charges themselves, criminal charges, are not vetted by prosecutors before they're laid. Police lay them, then prosecutors decide what to do with them. There's a pretty good argument that in Quebec and British Columbia, where prosecutors actually have to approve the charge before it gets laid in court, you end up with a much more legally consistent and legally accurate charge form. That the charges themselves tend to comply to the law to a much greater degree. So that's something, by the way, that's been called for in Ontario. But policy is what drives all of this, not the law.
Okay, a couple of things. One, I'm not opposed to the law being clarified once again. And I say that just as someone who watches bill after bill get passed that is nothing but a clarification of bills previously passed. So the argument that, it was done in 2012, so we never need to touch it again, that doesn't wash with me. And if they want to clarify it, that's good. But that's been a lot of the knocks against Poilievre's. But I understand what you're saying, and I think, there should be a push on that. And, the next time Premier Ford brings this up, I may raise this issue and say, well, it is up to you. But I may have whispered his name a couple of times, but, a certain columnist in the Globe and Mail is denouncing the idea that we would further clarify the law, saying, well, we don't want to be like the Americans, and that Poilievre's stand guard proposed legislation, would go further than the Americans. I don't really care what the Americans are doing. I care what our law is. I care what our traditions are, and our traditions and our law uphold this ability.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the case law bears that out. I don't know if you remember, actually, I'm sure you do remember, because we talked about it also, so you remember everything we talked about, but you remember the Ian Thompson case in Ontario.
Yeah,
right?
Down in St. Catharines area.
This is a man whose home was surrounded by thugs and firebombed with him inside it. And he happened to be a licensed firearms owner and a target shooter.
A gun instructor.
And he defended himself with a revolver. And that dragged through the court.
He didn't even shoot them. He fired over their heads.
Warning shots.
And was still charged.
Still charged. And ultimately completely vindicated. So, which tells you, I think that most of the time, and I know that defense lawyers love to gripe about judges and complain about rulings that we get, but I actually think that most of the time judges get this right. I think that they do apply the law of self-defense well, and that people who are entitled to acquittals get acquittals. But once again, I'll come back to where we started this conversation. That's really cold comfort. When you've lost your reputation, you've lost your business, maybe you've been detained, lost your firearms, your family and friends think you're a criminal, your name is splashed across media. right? It's always very interesting, by the way. I ask people about this when they say, well, what's the real stigma? Like, I say, can you tell me the names of the people who firebombed Ian Thompson's house? No, you can't. Nobody remembers them.
I'll admit this as someone in the media. You rarely, if ever, publish that someone isn't guilty, unless it's a big profile one. So, the police blotter that every newspaper has that, runs on local TV where you just say, oh, so-and-so was charged. The high profile cases, of course, there's an announcement they were acquitted, found not guilty, what have you. But the average person who gets their name splashed through the media doesn't get that. And that is a travesty. That's on my industry.
And I'll say this also,
as opposed to yours.
By the way, on defense, the defense lawyers play a role in this too. I, as a matter of practice, if there has been a story that my client was charged and the media, for whatever reason, didn't follow the acquittal, I go back and contact every journalist who wrote a story and ask that they either update the original story or write a new story. And the media is quite responsible when it's brought to their attention. But the trouble is, it's often not brought to their attention.
Yes, just often we don't know. There are so many criminal courts going on. I want to spend the last few minutes that we've got talking about political response to this. And Prime Minister Mark Carney on Friday did talk about updating the criminal code. And he said a few things that surprised me because the Trudeau Liberals brought in a bail reform package back in 2019 that was a disaster. It followed the same philosophical pattern as places like New York State and other progressive jurisdictions. And I just want to point out that New York State and other progressive jurisdictions in the United States saw the same horrific results as we did, with repeat violent offenders going through a revolving door. And, Democrat Governor Kathy Hochul in New York did a full reversal on that. We did a very partial one on specific cases. But, guys who are doing carjackings with guns, who are caught, charged, let out on bail, and then do it again, still get bail because of the way the criminal code is written in due to Bill C-75. So I want to play a clip of Mark Carney. He was asked about keeping people in the country, in terms of keeping high-quality people in the country and, boosting the economy. And he started talking about quality of life, and he started talking about crime and the need to crack down on crime. And here's what he had to say, which I wasn't expecting from him.
This government is committed to reforming the criminal code to ensure that organized crime, gang crime, crime with handguns, home invasions, auto theft, that the individuals who participate in those crimes pay the price they should, with consecutive sentencing, that they are not in a position where they commit a crime one day and they're arrested and then out on bail the next. So bail reform being at the heart of it. We're committed to having more officers at our border, 1,000 more border agents, more RCMP, committed to working more closely with the provinces. And I'll give you a specific example with respect to the last. We've been working with the Council of Federation, all the provinces, on bail reform. We will be legislating on that. We're proposing legislation, I should say, to the House on that next month. I met with Premier Ford this morning as part of an ongoing conversation about how we can address these issues, what the federal government needs to do on the criminal code. I agree with Premier Ford on these issues, and that's why we're moving on them. What the province and the municipality can do in terms of policing more effectively. So we're working very closely.
Solomon, were you surprised to hear that from the Prime Minister?
I was surprised, that those are not Liberal talking points traditionally. They come from the other side of the political spectrum. And I'll say this, and Brian, you and I have disagreed over this, and one of the wonderful things about speaking to someone like you, is open-minded and thoughtful, is you can have really polite and interesting disagreements. I think this is the wrong end of the policy problem. If you're talking about sentencing, bail is an interesting one. We could talk about bail. I think there is something to talk about bail. Once you're talking about consecutive sentences, number of sentences, you really admit, I can't solve the problem. So maybe on the back end, I can punish the people who are doing this, but I can't do anything about the problem. I think I live in Ottawa, and I have seen downtown Ottawa degenerate into a pretty scary place. And all of that, by the way, has been fueled by government policy. Drug distribution centers. We see what happens. We see what happens when petty crime is ignored. We see what happens when essentially there's no enforcement whatsoever of the kind of public order offenses that there used to be. The police have just given up completely.
You mentioned Ottawa, and I used to live there as well. That's how we got to know each other. But when I left 580 CFRA in January 2019, that's a station that I had worked at off and on since 2002. And I knew the Byward market very well, but I never had to step over people openly shooting heroin or fentanyl into their arms the way I did as I was leaving some of my last radio shows at 10 p.m. at night before I moved down to Toronto. And it degenerated horribly. Only gotten worse during the pandemic, and that is due to government policy. You're correct.
Right. And look, I want to be very clear. Drug addiction is something that I would never wish on my worst enemy. It is a horrible affliction. It deserves our compassion. It deserves our attention. It deserves treatment.
Absolutely.
But you walk down in the Byward market and you have random people who are high on drugs yelling at you, threatening to stab you, threatening you. Like, that happens all the time. And it is just totally ignored because progressive social policy dictates that you can't do anything in any way to deal with our neighbors who use drugs, right? Not fentanyl addicts who are stabbing people.
Before I left, the police had been instructed just to ignore open drug use and problems around it if it was anywhere near the safe injection sites and the like. And by the way, this is a tourist area, an economic engine for our nation's capital that is steps from Parliament Hill. But so what is your philosophical issue with consecutive sentences, though?
So my understanding of the research is that increasing sentences has no deterrent effect on criminal behavior. So once again, if you want to get to the root of the issue and say, how can we stop people from doing this? Sentencing does nothing to deter criminal behavior. So philosophically, that's it. So really what you're ending up, it's sort of at the end of the day, you're saying that doesn't mean there's no power in it. It's important, number one, that people who are a danger to the public be kept away from the public. That's a pretty good reason to have prison. What I would say on the other side, and I may be a libertarian when it comes to firearms. But I do have this soft, maybe we'll call it little progressive side to me. And that is what I would like to have in the world that I live in is a world where people who go into prison come out better than they went in. That is actually what would make the public safer. Right. And that's
well, to do that, you'd have to have things like drug treatment programs and therapy
and spend a lot of money
instead of handing out needles, which is what people are advocating for, or in some instances happening.
Well, and I'd say this, by the way, I think I'm not an expert on the penitentiary system. I know a little bit from my work as a criminal defense lawyer, but it's a university for criminals, Brian. People go in there, they're probably, had a BA in crime, they leave with a PhD because that's the environment that it is, right? And that, by the way, makes us all profoundly unsafe. So once again, if you're just talking about we're going to lock someone up for longer, if you're not locking someone up for life, like they're a dangerous offender, there are people like that, they're only coming out, generally speaking, worse than they went in.
Okay. Look, we've got a court system that has struck down a bunch of mandatory minimums. I don't think that we ever had really harsh mandatory minimums in this country, but we've had some struck down for like your third offense on a gun crime, you're going to get 3 years. I don't think that's a horrible idea. But our courts strike them down using what they consider reasonable hypotheticals. I think that's absolute garbage. I think that we do need to have some mandatory minimums. I don't believe in 3 strikes and you're out and we're locking you up for life. That goes too far and doesn't have any effect. Is there any effect in terms of denunciation and keeping dangerous people out of general society?
Yeah, and those are really important sentencing principles. So, one of the things that can also be done, and this is an important one, is to give judges other tools that they can use when it comes to community supervision, when it comes to probation. One of the problems is that when people get out often, they have very limited support and supervision, right? Because you have to remember, and I say this to people, and it's hard for people to hear, particularly for conservatives, which is 99% of people who go into jail are going to come out. And we have to deal with that effect. Now, if they come out with no support, then they go back exactly to the life that they went to previously. And if courts had tools where they could have exercise further control, so I'm a big believer in things like probation, things like community supervision, but if you don't fund those properly, they're useless. And if you don't give judges actual tools that have teeth, where you can be on probation for longer periods of time. So, when I started practicing, that length was 2 years, now 3 years. I think that they should have longer supervision orders, right? Where they have real mandatory, very challenging things, whether it's drug testing, whether it's, unannounced visits. But to do that, you got to pay money for these probation officers, police officers to be enforcing that. So I think that just saying, oh, we're going to give you a consecutive sentence, and we have consecutive sentences, by the way, in the criminal code for criminal organization offenses, for terrorism offenses, for other kinds of offenses, there are consecutive sentences. But the violent crime problem in this country just keeps getting worse. So I would advocate for doing, not just doing the same thing, but trying something different.
Let me ask you about bail before we let you go. Bill C-75. I mentioned it earlier. It was adopted. Seemed to be something that came out of the academic world. Oh, we should just, give people bail all the time. Yeah, most people should get bail. Most people should not be held in prison until their trial. But repeat violent offenders, I don't think fall into that category. How do we deal with this in a reasonable way? I've talked to friends who are JPs, and there was one case, I could tell you the address that this happened at, and you would be like, I'm not surprised. Repeat violent offender found with a loaded gun in their car, up on the dashboard, out on bail on existing gun and violent criminal charges, denied bail, overturned by a higher court. And so even if people are denied bail, the higher courts say no, they've got to have bail. Where do you draw the line, and how do you do it? And I get all the arguments that people like Doug Ford and other premiers need to build more prisons because growing population, we haven't done that. More crime, we haven't done that. But where do you draw the line legislatively? Because Prime Minister Carney has said he will give a review. So let's say you're in a briefing with Mark Carney. What do you tell him on this?
Yeah. So I like to start from the beginning, which is the supreme law in Canada. So the supreme law in Canada is the Constitution, and part of that Constitution is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms says everyone has the right to reasonable bail. Okay, so we have to start there. So there is a constitutional right to reasonable bail. What does reasonable bail mean? So the courts have said, for example, it means that you can't make a rule that for certain offenses, bail is impossible to attain. Okay, so there's no offense that you can say it's impossible that you get bail. So you might want to ask yourself, well, why is this?
That's fair.
Yeah, well, but what is this reasonable bail all about? And you hit the nail on the head, which is if we really believe in the presumption of innocence, like really believe in it, not pay lip service to it, then if someone's presumed innocent, then in most cases, they are not going to be detained before the state has an opportunity to prove that they're guilty. So I actually see, and I'm not avoiding the question directly. I'm saying that there are other elements to this solution. So one of the problems comes back to the first thing we talked about. What did we talk about? We said how trial in the Superior Court, the Supreme Court set a limit for 30 months. Okay, if trials only took 4 months to get to, 3 months to get to, you know that in California, you can be charged with any offense under the sun. You got a right to trial within 90 days. In 90 days, the state has to be ready to go and prove their case against you. All of a sudden, by the way, the bail dynamic shifts because the downside is not somebody sitting in detention for a year or 2 years or 3 years, right? So that's a big problem, that we have a massive backlog, which means we have to free people because, A, we don't have the resources to hold them. So you're talking about resources. The provincial detention centers are bursting at the seams. So practically speaking, we actually can't really detain more people than we're detaining. Now, there's 100% an issue where individuals who are charged with very serious violent offenses get out on bail for those and then commit other serious violent offenses. That is without a doubt a problem. And we see it happening, right? What I worry about, though, and by the way, this is what's going to happen. I can tell you, and you can have me back on 6 months from now, and you'll say you're right. There's going to be a review. There's going to be a lot of discussion. And if there's anything passed, it will be symbolic and meaningless. That is what's going to happen out of Prime Minister Carney's review, right? Because legally, there are restrictions to what you can do to limit people's access to bail, because you have people who are innocent who get charged with offenses, sometimes even serious offenses, and you can't have those people detained pre-trial. My view is, I'll come again to the same thing I said when it comes to sentencing. There are alternatives to detaining people pre-trial, but they are really expensive and they require resources, right? A number of jurisdictions in the United States, they have real bail supervision programs, right? So the trouble is bail, if it's just bail and you get out, you don't have a lot of supervision. So there's some GPS monitoring in Canada, but the police do not have the resources to monitor alleged offenders who are on bail. And notice I said alleged offenders because they are only alleged offenders. But once again, those are things that cost money. My worry is every time the criminal code gets amended, and it gets amended over and over again. I have in my office, I have criminal codes from the 50s. I got a good library. Yeah, every once in a while you get a really old offense, and it's good to go pull out the annotated criminal code from the 50s. Every year, the criminal code gets thicker and thicker and thicker because governments love adding to it. Because the criminal code doesn't cost any money to amend. Now, it has huge costs, financial and social downstream, but it doesn't cost any money. When the real solutions, from what we started talking about this, whether it's addressing drug addiction, or how about actually addressing mental illness in our community? Right? The prevalence of individuals who have untreated mental illness, and nobody wants to go anywhere near that because it's expensive and resource intensive. It costs money to do those things. It costs money to have actual programming in jail as opposed to just warehousing human beings. It costs money to supervise people when they're out, after they've completed a sentence. It costs money to supervise people when they're on bail. So the government always does the easy thing. Let's just pass another law. Let's make another mandatory minimum. Let's make another consecutive sentence. And in my view, those are Band-Aid solutions, and they don't get at the root of the issues.
You're taking me to one of my views of the phrase that I hate hearing from politicians all the time. Some horrific event happens, and they say, we need to make sure this can never happen again. Well, in those types of circumstances, there's nothing that they can do to make sure those things don't happen again. What you're talking about is there are things that they can do, but they don't want to do them, and they don't want to fund them.
That's exactly it. And if we keep going down that circle, so the don't want to do them is an interesting one, because the don't want to do them is they're politically unpopular, particularly where these progressive views that certain subjects are untouchable. Like, just so you know, when you say safe injection site, and you can say that to any criminal lawyer, we are a small L liberal bunch. We believe in freedom. We believe in liberty. But you talk about safe injection sites, they're handing out drugs to people. Those people, the research clearly shows they are selling those drugs and buying more powerful drugs. Who are they selling the drugs to? Who are they selling the Dilaudid to? They're selling it to kids who don't qualify for these programs. They're selling it to teenagers, high school students. The research in BC is outrageous. And then they're buying fentanyl. So that's what we've done, basically. In the name of what? Progressivism and compassion? That's not compassion. That's abject cruelty. And it has all these terrible downstream effects when it comes to violent crime. So once again, the hard to do means maybe we have to challenge some of these previously untouchable political third rails. I don't know how they got that way, by the way. They weren't that way when I started practicing law. And that just makes me feel old. But now that this is received truth, it's nonsense. And it results in an unsafe community. And it's something that we should take on. And we should elect politicians who are brave enough to take it on. Unfortunately, that does not seem to be the pattern we've been following the past decade.
All right, Solomon, whether it's having you back on the podcast or not, I will check back with you 6 months after Prime Minister Carney's review and changes to bail have come in. And unfortunately, I fear you will be right. Thanks so much for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. Kevin Libin is the executive producer of this program. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Please make sure that you hit subscribe on whatever platform you listen to us on, and share this on social media. Help us out, leave us a review, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you.
So, although abortion was sort of accessible, it really wasn't.
But then 1988 rolls around. And what's the law on abortion then? Suddenly, there wasn't one. Literally no restrictions existed in 1988. Abortion went from heavily restricted to completely unrestricted almost overnight. There was no referendum on this. There wasn't even an act of parliament. This whole thing is due to a somewhat surprise decision out of the Supreme Court of Canada. And it came about in large part because of one man, a Canadian doctor who had been relentless about running illegal abortion clinics since the 1960s and was determined to overturn the laws prohibiting the practice. Along the way, he endured multiple arrests, constant raids, a jail term, a firebombing of his clinic, an attack by a fanatic wielding garden shears, the approbation of virtually his entire profession, and frequent death threats. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.